is although that creates a kind of exchange and relation, that equal sign also runs the risk of saying that something is just $20, reductionism, or that its value is $20, right? And so the issue is that creates economic activity, because now if the cup that's worth $20 is equal to the book that's $20, and you have the book, I have the cup, there's the possibility of a transaction. But the basis of that transaction is reductionism. The whole reason that transaction can occur is due to a reductionism. And the reason why this is important is because a lot of what Vervaeke, the meaning crisis, meta crisis, a lot of people talk about is the problem of reductionism, right? That everything is being reduced. They're exactly right. The issue is that reductionism, though, isn't a mistake. It's a feature of the modern world. It's an essential feature to make possible interaction of difference. Because the more and more you're dealing with pluralism, the more and more you are dealing with complexity. And how in the world do you get the Hindu and the Christian to interact and have anything to talk about? Well, because they have a book and I have a cup that's both worth $20. So we have a common basis, right? And you see, the issue is that if you're going to move away from reductionism, you have to make people able to handle difference and have grounds of conversation and interaction that are non-reductionistic, which is very difficult. Because the moment I start saying, well, let's try to figure out the relation between the book and the cup that isn't based on fungibility, well, where does the conversation even begin? You know, why should I think, like, you'd have to explain to me the book, I'd have to explain to you the cup, you're in a different culture, this cup was my grandma's, it's really valuable, you couldn't care less that it belonged to my grandmother. On what basis do we interact? Another problem, what do most people talk about? Most people talk about their job. Like, what did you do at work today? What are your plans today? It all centers around the economic man, right? Well, the economic man is a reductionistic phenomenon. You know, it kind of reduces. But if I know as a Christian that I have a job and you as an atheist have a job, or you as a liberal have a job, okay, we have a common basis of interaction. I can avoid talking about your beliefs. I can avoid talking about dangerous things because I know we have in common work, right? Likewise, I know we have in common the news. Like, what are the news? What are the stories? Paul Virilio, interaction, website. We can talk about the news. Now, this gets you mentioned Jordan Hall, the blue, but that means we have in common the manipulation of the blue church, maybe, right? We have the interactions. But notice what's going on. All of these things exist to give something for people to interact with one another that is really necessary if we're different. Now, if we're all from Rustburg, Virginia, and we all know the town, we know the values, we may be able to interact outside of money, outside of job. You know, the more and more you share givenness or a commonality, the more and more you're able to interact on terms that are non-reductionistic. Because we can talk about the history of Rustburg. We can talk about the festival. We can talk about the diner. We can talk about a history because we have a shared history. And this gets into Michelle Bowen's modes of exchange, Karatani, and different things. It's much easier to have a gift economy when I know what the other believes is a gift, right? Because, like, the issue is if I give you a gift and you're very different, the thing that I think is a gift, you may take as an insult. That almost gets into the Gary Chapman love languages, right? So gifts are much easier in a place of similarity. The more and more you move toward diversity, the more and more it becomes difficult to have any modes of exchange other than the commodity form, or reducing everything into their potential. Because here's getting back to Heidegger. In the same way that I can interact with you on terms of $20, similarity, exchangeability, and all of that, likewise, I can say, oh, let's talk about how this river is potential electricity. Let's talk about what we could do to grow the economy. Let's talk about the potentials of what could be, right? Well, that also gives us a basis of interaction, but it's still reductionistic because I'm treating the river as potential electricity, right? And likewise, I'm talking about potential inventions or potential AI, none of which is necessarily bad. No one is saying this is necessarily bad. The problem is when you can only think according to that orientation. A way to think about it is, you know how in capitalism there's always a warning against monopolies. You know, if you get a monopoly, it tends to stifle innovation, costs go up, all of these different problems, right? So monopolies are bad. Well, there actually is such thing as worldview monopoly or ontology monopoly, where there's only a single way to see things, say as standing reserve or as capital or as facts, right? Usually in an economy, you don't have a single monopoly. You tend to have like five. I guess you could talk about the Magnificent Seven or something like that in America or something. Well, generally speaking, there's, I don't know, 4 or 5 worldview monopolies, if you grant me that language, that has defined the modern world. Facticity, pragmatic, science, reductionism, commodity form, stuff like that. And you see, none of these are necessarily bad if there was greater diversity of worldview options to check and balance each of those worldviews from overfitting. Computer science talks about overfitting, underfitting, and things like that, right? And you're always looking for a kind of bi-fitting, I think is the term. Well, in order to, and if I get any of that wrong, feel free to correct me. That's no issue at all. And it's like, what you need is that competition of different worldviews, right? Because if you don't, what's going to likely happen is you're only able to see the river as standing reserve or its monetary value versus, say, what Heidegger talks about is the poetry of Holstein, I think, like the poets. Like it's no longer something that stimulates poetry. Like the river is not something that makes you move into a poetic standpoint or a state in which being discloses itself because you're too busy thinking of it in terms of, is that river practical? Could we get rid of it to put in houses? You're moving it instantaneously into exchangeability. Now, maybe the river should be removed for houses. Maybe it should be turned into electricity. But the likelihood of making an accurate assessment greatly goes down if you're stuck in a monopoly of interpretation, a monopoly of worldview, right? So what ends up happening is Heidegger later on talks about wine, W-I-N-E. And what's very interesting is he talks about something basically in his book on poetry, music, something like that. He talks about how it is only in the wine that the grape reveals itself fully, that the grape discloses the fullness of the grape, that fancy Heidegger language where beings, clearings, all that stuff. But the grape comes forth as itself. Whoa, Heidegger. I thought you were just telling me that the river gets reduced into standing reserve when it's turned for electricity. Why isn't the grape standing reserve, right? Why is wine not a standing reserve? Well, because there seems to be a difference for him between technology and tool. And another way to put it is between a technology that reduces the thing and a skill or art that honors the thing. And what he's trying to seemingly kind of get at is that the modern world is full of techne and technology, but it has lost the capacity to treat things like rivers or waters in a manner that honors it as an art form. Like it's the difference between the art of making he would say that today we have the technique of making electricity, but we're yet to have the art of making electricity. We have the technique of, say, creating cities, but we haven't learned the art of making cities. And as a result, things do not disclose themselves, and that's a wonderful association with Buber. It absolutely is the thou that has to come forth in different things. It is the clearing by which things disclose themselves. And so another way to put this, and then I'll give it back to you, Ivan Illich talks about tools of conveniality. And I know Jordan Hall has talked about, he's got Ivan Illich influence, which he likes with conveniality and different things like that. Ivan Illich is a very profound thinker beyond even his critiques of education, because he gets into useful unemployment, he gets into the tools, he gets into the difference. One of my favorite books is he talks about the difference between H2O and the waters of forgetfulness, where he's like, today we can only see water as H2O. We can't see it as the substance of poetry. So there's something very Heideggerian going on in Ivan Illich that he didn't really apparently read a lot of people, but just in his own observations, he makes a lot of overlaps with Foucault, Heidegger, and people like that. But what Illich is asking is, how do we have tools that extend humanity versus replace humanity? How do we have technologies that extend humanity versus replace humanity? And I think Heidegger, when he's talking about art versus technology, techna, is getting at this distinction. And this is how I would sum it up in a better fashion. So yeah, we can compare the river with the wine, but let's actually compare two bottles of wine that look exactly the same. Two red bottles of wine, and they're exactly the same. The red wine, same color. You cannot tell the difference. If you walked into a room and you saw the two bottles of wine, you would assume they were the same, okay? But what if I were to tell you one of those bottles of wine came off a conveyor belt, all machine, all production, while the other was made by a craftsman who was able to make that wine over years and years and years. But they tasted the same, they looked the same, and you couldn't tell the difference. The question is the following: is there still yet a difference between those bottles of wine because of the process and the story that generated them? Basically, Ivan Illich and Heidegger are suggesting that if we're not able to say yes and know why we say yes, then we are not going to be able to move into the modern world or the future without being overtaken by our technology. Because our conviction of that difference will be too weak. And basically, we won't be able to say with any confidence that there's a difference between wine that is created from an artistic process of a craftsman and wine that is produced by a machine, even though they taste exactly the same. And that is what I think we're facing with today. Imagine, to take the story another way, imagine you saw a painting, or you went in that was made entirely by Dali or a machine, and you saw the exact same painting and it was made by a human being. We as human beings are going to increasingly simply have to choose to believe there's a difference as a kind of conviction, that there's a quality in the painting by the human being that is there, making possible a kind of Walter Benjamin aura that the machine-based painting cannot create. Now, that's not to say the machine-based painting is not good or doesn't have a quality that the human base can't make. But we are increasingly going to have to choose, almost as a kind of act of faith, that there is something the human can add to the world that can be added by nothing else. And in fact, to the degree that machines can add it is to the degree that we made machines to be able to add it, right? Like, I think it was John Seale who said, we very often say, oh, the brain is just a computer. Well, there's no computers in nature, though. Like, we had to make computers to say that the brain was like a computer, right? So, the issue is that there's an idea that Heidegger and Ivan Illich, and more can be said, but I'll give it to you just for any thoughts or anything. We have to increasingly believe that there is a different quality between phenomena that are exactly the same in the end result because the process is different. And that also is suggesting that something is added by a lifetime of developing an art to be able to make wine as a craftsman that cannot be gained by using a machine to do the same thing. And what this would ultimately mean that there's something valuable about processes. Processes themselves create subjects in ways that cannot be made without those processes. That the learning to make wine makes you a different person than someone who has access to that wine simply because of a machine. That the processes change society. And I really like what Ivan Illich says in Tools of Conviviality. He makes this point where he says, look at a prison. People complain in prisons that the people have food and shelter, often better than the people outside of prison, right? Like they have everything, they don't have any bills. But Ivan Illich says, but their punishment is in that they have no say or involvement in their world. That they are exactly, the world that they are in has no reflection with themselves. Sure, they have fooding, they have shouting, but it's completely detached from them in relationship, right? And so likewise, if we have a world where AI or different things is able to provide everything to us, we're at risk of actually all being in a prison, not because we are denied everything, but precisely because we have access to everything, but no autonomy or say or relation to the things that are made. And in the process of developing art or developing the subjectivity, that allows us to feel like we are participating in the world, of which becomes the last kind of terrain that we need to focus on in a world where everything is already provided. The difference between the wine that comes off the machine and the wine that we make is participation. We participate in the wine in a different way. And the key difference between art and skill is the fullness of participation. art is a fullness of participation. And maybe a better word from skill, for Heidegger would be technique, because some people by skill may mean art, but words are tricky and we can never find the perfect terms. But what's interesting, and Jonathan Pageau has made this point, and he's correct on this, is that the word art used to be a word for skill. Like art was not something you hung on the wall. It was something you had. You were an art. The painter was the painting in a sense. The painter was not merely the producer of paintings. The painter was a way of life that, like an overflowing wine cup, paintings came out of. Like an artist is someone who just finds themselves painting because it overflows from them, right? Whereas what Heidegger's point is that a technique is something that it doesn't flow out of you. Yeah, you can fix the engine, but you never just in self-forgetfulness find yourself making engines. It's your job, right? It's the thing you do. Where a painter, they're just overflowing with the painting, right? It's just coming out of them. It's just what they do. Heidegger and Ivan Illich are suggesting that the human subject in an increasingly technological world must be the subject which things just flow out of. Because if not, you're going to look around. If not, the only reason you do things is to create things or to produce things, but all those things are produced by something else. And so you think about the fact that I'm not needed, and thus you fall into melancholy and all those things. Versus if you're an artist and you're just created, you're not paying attention. The artist isn't really paying attention to what other people are doing. They don't care. Like, you don't care that Dali is making paintings. You don't care that ChatGPT can write a short story because it just comes out of you. So the subject, to handle, dare I say, the trauma of realizing AI can create short stories just like you, the way you avoid that trauma is to simply be an overflowing wine cup, to be overflowing with the creative act, because then you don't really care. In fact, the chances of AI generating the exact same story as you or the exact same painting is like zero. It's very, very low. Now, could they produce a story? Maybe even an amazing story? Absolutely. But they cannot generate your story, nor can they do the process of being the kind of subject who can overflow with that kind of story for you, right? Like only you can engage in the life to reach the place where you find yourself so overflowing, right? AI can't give you self-forgetfulness. AI can't give you flow. AI can't give you the experience of having the conditionality to so overflow, right? And so basically, what comes down to when I think art, and the reason why art is a very big deal, if art by all this means the life of overflowing, which is emotional, intellectual, and all that, what Heidegger is suggesting, in my opinion, is that in the wine, W-I-N-E, the grape, the reason why the grape gives forth its full being in the wine is because the wine is a product of the overflowing art of the winemaker that the grape's fullness is found in participating in. And it sacrifices itself, almost like a religious sacrifice, for the sake of the metaphysical possibility of the relation that comes out in that artistic process. Whereas with the river wine of Standing Reserve, the guy's just doing it. Guy self. Whereas the maker is engaging in this radical overflowing of the self. And so for Heidegger, that suggests a radical difference that comes forth. So the electrician, when the guy who makes the river for the electricity, because I think I froze there for a minute. So the electricity the electricity of the Standing Reserve is not a product of an overflowing subject in a state of self-forgetfulness. Whereas the wine is a product of an overflowing self-forgetfulness of the winemaker. And thus the wine discloses that kind of being to you, the possibility of living as a subject who can overflow with art. Whereas the Standing Reserve does not reveal to you that possibility of subjectivity. So art becomes central because art is the revelation of the new kind of subject that we must have in the horizon of AI to not be overwhelmed to it, but to rise to its occasion to engage in this kind of subjectivity. But let me throw it back to you.
Oh my God, man. Yeah, wow. It's like a crescendo that you ended on. Wow. Wow. I mean, it really is, that is the crescendo to end on, right? Because it brings it all together. Wow, so fascinating. So cool. So let's see. There's different things. Um, so there's one interesting avenue of thought that has been entertained by other people, so I don't know if we want to go down that route, is that we are born as creators and as creatives,
Mm,
as artists, and
mm,
conditioned out of us. At least this is an assumption that I work with, and
yeah.
uh, if I didn't have the restrictions that my parents and the system and whatever told me, like, oh, you can't really make money playing guitar, then it just remains a hobby, or not even, because I have to actually focus on making money and getting a job and whatever. So then that creative side of me can't unfold. So this is one thing. Then yeah, I'm sort of marinating in what you said at the end there, that that let's say that fullness of the wine itself, or like that the in some ways, yeah, I guess you could even say the subjectivity of the wine uh,
Yeah.
discloses that possibility of that qualitative or creative difference in being for other people. And that's sort of also why I
Yep.
think we're deepening what Jordan shared in that little snippet. It's like that the fact that we want to work with those people in the beginning is interesting, because it's like this invites what we want everybody to be in the end, which is like living their vocation and their calling and their unique self. So a lot of like Mark Gaffney's language came into my mind when you were speaking, because it's like unique self and unique gift, and you're bringing these unique qualities that only you can bring, and you're really overflowing in eros, he would say, and just radical aliveness and creativity and wholeness and all these things. So it's very aligned with his work, just as a background information for you to know. I don't know how familiar you are with his stuff.
Oh, it's outstanding. And not to interrupt, I mean, all of that is very good. And I should note that on what Mr. Hall was saying on this idea of the bread maker, the duty, like the characteristic of art is this overflowing. You just find yourself doing, and you're like, oh, like a good sign that you're engaged in your art is if someone goes, oh, are you doing that to make money? You go, what? Oh, I get, like, there's a kind of like surprise when people ask you why you do it, because to you it's just what you find yourself doing, and it's part of something more. And actually, as an aside, I think this actually gets at one of the major mistakes for why metaphysics was thrown away in the 20th century when it really shouldn't have been. And if I were to sum it up very simply, Derrida tells us that, like, looking at Aristotle on the idea that when I say that's a bookshelf, that's a signifier to the signified. And he said, well, you can never get from the signifier to bookshelf, like the form, right? You can never cross that divide. That's kind of the great divide. Or you can never, from the word cat, get to the phenomenon of cat. It's an arbitrary signifier, and if you try, you get an infinite difference. So there's this gap that suggests the impossibility of metaphysics, because whatever metaphysics you create, it may be over here, but here's the world, and you can never cross that gap, right? So, et cetera, so forth. Now, Derrida makes very good points, and I have actually very high respect for Derrida. I think there's some major problems with throwing him in this deconstruction, soup or different things, because you got to look at books like The Gift of Death, his work on clearing, anyway, A Trace of the Painting is a great work. Anyway, the mistake, though, is the following, in my opinion. When I look at that bookshelf and say, that's a bookshelf, I've already apprehended it as a bookshelf. Then the gap appears. This is the mistake. When you ask me, how do I know that's a bookshelf? Well, then I can't, then it's infinite difference. But the question is the following, the initial apprehension. How did I apprehend it as a bookshelf? Because then substance, essence, and form are all together, kind of the Aristotelian metaphysics. And really the key to Aristotle, in my opinion, is the phenomenological apprehension, the moment of, bam, I know that's Nicholas. Ah, I know that's Michelle. How do you know it? I don't know. So here's the thing. Often we find the metaphysical in the grasping, not the asking. We've tried to locate metaphysics in the asking of the justification, and as a result, we've disavowed the grasping and thus lost ourselves. Because the human is a being of, got it, grasping. And what is the key characteristic of beauty? That's beautiful. If I ask you, how do you know that's beautiful? Or what is art? You get confused, right? But everyone knows what it is when you see it. The strike of beauty is right there. That is the basis of metaphysics. Metaphysics begins in the basis of the strike of beauty, as we've called it with Jockin, like the strike of that initial moment of apprehending. That is the bookshelf. Yes. How is it possible? What are the, phenomenology is always asking not merely the experience, but what are the conditions that are necessary for me to have that experience, right? What must reality be like so that I am able to apprehend that's a bookshelf, right? So likewise, once you ask that, now you're in a metaphysics that's basing it on a concrete apprehension of a thing, right? And what must reality be like so that we just apprehend the things around us? Maybe we apprehend them right, maybe we apprehend them wrong. That actually doesn't matter. We apprehend it all, and it is intelligible to us, and it can compel our action. And that apprehension makes social intelligibility possible. It makes individual choice possible. It makes everything possible. But apprehension is fundamentally relational. And this, of course, is getting into our Whiteheads and Landry and all, Viveki, right? But the apprehensive act is the basis of metaphysics and the purest form of apprehension that denies the possibility of definition in favor of the definitive particular object is beauty. Beauty refuses to be defined. And so this is why beauty becomes fundamental for the question of metaphysics. And I think, I have all these ones with the great Thomas Jockin, who's an expert on beauty and Plato and Aristotle and all that. There's very good reason to think that for Plato, and I know Sindler, D.C. Sindler, who's a great Balthasar scholar. He does a lot now on Plato and different things. There's a good argument to be had that beauty was the highest value. But beauty was not merely pretty, but it was the gathering of reality, like in Dante with the dancing of the spheres. Like, we don't really understand beauty today because we're trying to define it, versus beauty be the apprehension of which gathers us that cannot be defined because it can only be experienced. We don't actually believe in experiences that you can't give definitions for. And what Derrida shows you is that definition is ultimately impossible, and we interpret that as meaning that thus nothing is possible, when really we should have interpreted that as meaning that we need to focus more on the apprehension and the experience. So we took the truths of postmodernism in the wrong direction, really. Like, they unveiled to us that you can't base reality on definition. Like, you can't base, like, another way to put this is that Derrida is like, if you try to define a word according to definitions, you can't really do it. But you know what Plato tries to define words as? A perpetual orbiting. What's justice? Well, let's just keep orbiting. That's how you define words. Derrida is showing you defining words through a dictionary is not possible. You define reality through a continually orbiting in community and in relation, trying to apprehend it. Plato, in the dialogue, shows you the correct way to define words. Derrida should have been interpreted as evidence of needing to go back to Plato. And I actually think there are parts of Derrida that he understood that. But instead, we just kind of buckled down and said, well, I guess philosophy's over then. That's not what it should have meant. It should have meant that the philosophy of algebra is over in favor of the philosophy of geometry. So we misunderstood. Now, with that, therefore, what you want is the subject. When we talk about the duty of the bread maker, the artist, someone of whom is engaged in the subjectivity of art is someone of whom you just apprehend in a special way. You apprehend them with a quality. You just know it. They have that Walter Benjamin aura that he talks about. And aura is a very useful concept because it's also aesthetic. So Walter Benjamin made this point where he said it's very difficult now to see the Mona Lisa and it strikes you with an aura because there's so many replicas of it, right? Like, you've seen all these images. So the aura of art goes away. It's much more difficult for art to have a certain aura because of replication, right? And Walker Percy plays on this in Messages in the Bottle, like where he says, the problem with visiting the Grand Canyon now is you've already seen pictures of the Grand Canyon before you go there. So you're confirming a photograph versus letting the fullness of the beauty of the Grand Canyon hit you. So we exist in an age.
This is for like everything since digital, right? It's like and then just imagine metaverse and the implications of that. Like,
exactly. Everything now is radically replicatable. The only way to fight that is by becoming radically particular to the point where you cannot be replicated. And the only way to do that is the subjectivity of art and beauty, because beauty is not replicatable. Because beauty is the following, a way to put it, it's inseparable from the experience. The way I like to describe it is the following. Imagine that back in the 19th century, I think it's 19th, someone comes along and say, hey, we're going to go to this concert tonight. You've never heard music, or the only music you've ever heard is maybe in a pub, maybe a guitar or something, but you really, there's no MP3s, there's no records, there's no vinyls, but you're going to go to a concert. Okay. So that evening, you go to a concert hall and you hear Beethoven's Ninth, and you will never hear it again in your entire life. And no one even knows that Beethoven's Ninth is going to be played tonight. And no one even knows what Beethoven's Ninth is. And you never get a recording of it. And that's the only time you ever hear of it. Imagine 20 years later, you telling people about this experience, and they go, okay, Gramps. It's like, no, I'm telling you, there was this beauty that I don't even know how to describe it. Imagine being there on the night of the premiere of Beethoven's Ninth, before it's Beethoven's Ninth, and that's the only time in your entire life you will ever experience it. That is the kind of experience that conditions the subject in a manner that then inspires them to live in terms of beauty. It's very easy to believe life is meaningful when that kind of experience happens. And it's also then much easier to be motivated to keep living, because now you know reality is a place where that kind of experience is possible, right? Because you can be surprised. You know it's possible to be surprised with that which you didn't even know was there to surprise you, right?
Yeah.
That enchant, you see, when Charles Taylor, in my opinion, talks about, and I think it's based on Weber and all that in A Secular Age, he talks about the loss of enchantment. He's getting at something important. The problem is, I think you have to link enchantment to that one-of-one transient experience that I just said. Enchantment is not merely a matter of believing that God exists and therefore reality is meaningful, because that can just be a stagnant, stale belief. You can believe God exists and it doesn't compel you. Enchantment requires that kind of thing, of encountering Beethoven's Ninth before you know it's Beethoven's Ninth and maybe never seeing it again. That creates a kind of sacred romance, a kind of who has seen the wind, neither I nor you, but when the trees bend down their head, the wind is passing through. That creates a certain enchantment of being. So here's the thing. What if subjectivities could develop themselves to be like to one another in experience of Beethoven's Ninth? Exactly. When you encountered the bread maker, they were like a Beethoven's Ninth. And maybe you never again encounter that same bread maker in that particularity, right? The very experience of reality of subjects that were like Beatrice's, that were the strikes of beauty. Because here's the key point I was trying to say. Beauty is the strike of beauty. That strike of an experience where, bam, Beethoven's Ninth, and you didn't know Beethoven's Ninth, and you'll never hear it again. We have to locate the question of beauty not in the definition of what is beauty, but in the strike of beauty. That's the objectivity of beauty. That's actually also critically, if I'm reading the third critique of Kant correctly, when he talks about the critique of judgment, he bases judgment on the experience of the sublime, which is kind of weird. But what he's suggesting is when you encounter something beautiful, you know it exists. Because he's got this huge problem for the first critique, right? Like phenomenon, noumenon, everything's split. How do you get to the things themselves? And how do you not know that everything's just in your head? Now, there's different ways he goes about this. But the thing that's funny, he's like, when something beautiful occurs, your brain, in a sense, turns off, and yet the world doesn't vanish. Therefore, there's reason to think that the world is there, even if you're stuck in your phenomenon. So the beautiful gives you reason to believe that there's a world outside of you, even if you can never get beyond the phenomenon. Now, I have criticisms. I think Kant, it's easy to kind of make fun of Kant, but actually there's a lot of genius in Kant. Now, I have criticisms of the whole noumenon, from a Hegelian point of view. The point is, though, beauty is an experience that there is a reality beyond my head. And it's kind of funny because we often associate beauty with subjectivity. Oh, that's just what you think is beautiful. No. What Kant is saying is the strike of beauty shows you there's a world outside of you because it's always surprising. You can only be surprised if there's something external to you. Surprise is not possible unless there is something that is beyond your brain, right? Like there was something in the world that surprised me. The problem is we try to ask questions about beauty outside the experience of it. Therefore, we're in the realm of not apprehension, but definition that Derrida showed you can never get out of. So then we're like, well, beauty doesn't exist. Well, truth doesn't exist. Goodness doesn't exist. But instead, if we ask, right, and then I'll give it to you, instead, if we locate it in the radical moment of apprehension and really look closely at that and ask, how do we spread that? How do we spread the conditions of possibility for more and more people to have that strike of beauty, and then to live such in a manner that they provide that strike of beauty to one another? And if you so do that, the subject is overflowing in a manner that is not worried about what AI is doing or what other people are doing, because it pours out of you. Please, Nicholas.
So many things. Wow. So okay. Wow, 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 wow. I always need to say that after hearing you speak. So question, and I'll say a bit more, but just question for that arose. I'd be curious for you to unpack how you would define then the difference between novelty and beauty, right? So there seems to be something around each and every moment of life, being radically novel, and there is beauty in that, right? And of course, there's a difference. We're using with these words in a certain way. And I had a conversation this morning actually with or like a text message in a group with some people from yeah, this philosophy group, and it was about like somewhat applying what we're talking about in a relationship, right? In the terms of like, oh wow, like I'm with this partner, and you, and it's like the best way to practice this in a way, right? Because it's like, oh my God, it's never the same person. It's continuous process, and this person is continuously, ideally, hopefully, expressing more and more of themselves, of their unique selves into the world, more of their fullness, more of their wholeness, more of their eros, I would say. And so you never meet the same person twice, right? Like the river keeps on flowing. You never step in the same river twice, right? So it's like if I look into your eyes, I'm seeing somebody new. And so it's new, but there's something about the notion of beauty in all of this that seems to be very important. The other thing is, Zach Stein and Mark Gaffney in their book First Principles, First Values, which is great. It's a lot about value and the field of value. So they're saying the Tao is the field of value in a sense, and just other language, and that the field of value is both eternal and evolving. So it's adding a process dimension to value. It's not just static. And eros is just, it's not just about love, it's love in motion, right? It's always evolving. So that's the only way. I mean, that's what made me understand and appreciate the word eros, because I was like, okay, that's actually more accurate. And so in one of the conversations with Zach, what I found very interesting, and I'm thinking now also in terms of algebra versus geometry, is like Zach said something like, and it's a really cool point. He was like, where is the math? Where is mathematics? Right? And I don't know, you probably have a whole philosophy interpretation of this, but like it's a super cool question, because it's like, is it in here? Is it out there? Where is it? Because I can build fucking missiles and weapons and all the shit with it. I can show that it's like it's real, right? But it's also like super fucking subjective, because it's all happening in here, and yet I can still like write equations and show you what I mean. So there's a relationship. There's like, so he says we should think of value in the same way as we think of mathematics. It's not in here, it's not out there, it's in between, and so the beauty is also is has the same sort of quality, right? It's like it's everywhere. It's in between. It's the most radical thing. And yeah, I do think a lot of forests like triples, right? And beauty being the most fundamental, because it's like it grounds the rest, right? It's like the true and the good only matter because it's all beautiful. So those are some thoughts. Yeah.
Outstanding. So there's a few things. First off, I think the question on not first off, before I forget, on the question of are children innately creative, I think there's very good reason to think that they are more intrinsically motivated than not. This was Deleuze's critique of Freud and Oedipus, where they're like, that you don't see children living as if they want to get back to the womb. You see them playing with Legos. They're always making new creations, new connections and things, and so on and so forth. So they're like this, if you pay attention to children, you don't see a lacking subject. But when you look at adults, you do. So something happens. And this is what I like to say, because I think it's a very important subject. Everyone basically seems to start very Deleuzian, very creative. They're just going out. You can't really capture children. They have their own line of flight, to use Deleuzian terms. What I think occurs is the encounter with the other, where we locate the Lacanian das Ding that then causes anxiety. And then they experience the lack of the other, but this doesn't tend to occur until they're like 10 or something, or maybe 8. I'm not sure. It could change for a lot of children in different ways. And then the problem is, once they encounter that lack, they then move from intrinsic motivation to an external motivation to try to be safe to the world or money or different things. And they try to fill that lack.
Lacanian das Ding?
Yes, it's the das Ding, or you have the real or the lock. And let me put it this way. There's different ways to interpret the das Ding. The das Ding is that of which you can never bring into your symbolic or imaginary register. And let's put it this way. I can never inhabit your consciousness. I can never know what you're thinking. And I suddenly at some age have an encounter where you can think things that say I'm stupid, or that I'm bad, or that's disappointed. You become a possible housing of thoughts that reflect on me. And I can't access them, and I can't even know what's going on. And so I'm anxious. Suddenly, the other is a house of judgments. The other is someone of whom can deny me status or not, and I have to live with that knowledge. And that's very difficult to live with. Where children don't think about that so much, and certainly they're not thinking about their social status, but then the day comes when they do. The trick is we've got to figure out basically how to move from what I call like cheap Deleuze to costly Deleuze. We have to go from a kind of Deleuze, going to the lack, and then returning to the creativity. And that's our challenge now. And you see, there's hope for the possibility of this challenge, which I associate with leaving Plato's cave on our own. Because what ends up happening is we end up in a cave and we don't know we're in it and nobody comes for us. So we simply have to have the creativity and play to get up and leave on our own. Not because anyone tells us, but because we just are capable of imagining that possibility and not being paralyzed by anxiety from actually getting up and leaving. But that requires the conditioning of the subject to work and integrate with lack back to a costly Deleuze, which is an adult that is able to be, you could say it's the movement from childish to childhood in Nietzsche. The movement from just being more childish, not mature, but returning through the crucible of maturity and economics and life back to a childlike state. This is very, very difficult. And the artist has something childlike about them. I think it was Picasso who said, everyone starts a child. The challenge is staying one. And I think basically everyone starts an artist. The challenge is staying one. Well, that basically means you somehow are able to have a society by which people encounter lack and actually go through lack or anxiety or adulthood, whatever language you want to use, the psychoanalytical crucible. They're able to go through that back to childhood. And I think that also, though, gets at the difference a bit between novelty and beauty. Because novelty often can be something that doesn't have to go through a crucible. You can create something new simply because it is new. I can have I can go to a town I've never gone before, but I'm actually doing it to escape anxiety. I'm actually doing it to escape boredom. I can use novelty in service of avoiding lack or avoiding myself. And yet, a surprise entails novelty. Beauty entails the unexpected. Hegel often talks about sublation. And what a sublation is that you take the old and it's included in the new. But if you just have the old, that's no good. So, for example, if you have beauty, you also have novelty. But if you only have novelty, you won't necessarily have beauty. You've got to have both. You've got to have a sublation. It's like that C.S. Lewis principle where he says if you put first things first, you get second things also. But if you put second things first, you lose both. And that's often what happens. Also, novelty as an emphasis can lead to the cheap deluge, where we're just trying to be different and novel and express ourselves in a way that no one else is like, and it becomes chaos, right? And you lose social intelligibility because everyone is always trying to be novel, and thus I can't relate to them because they're too different from what they were. And then I also feel alienated from them because they're too novel, right? So novel has to be something that you don't aim for. It has to be a secondary thing that then people describe beauty afterwards as novel. Novelty has to be a description of something that was not planned to be novel, because when you try to make something novel, you tend to cut corners, or you go for shock value, or you create something new according to what you think is new, but you're in a finite frame, and actually someone over there invented it. You just didn't know it. You thought it was novel, but it wasn't actually. So novel should not be a goal. Novelty should be a description that follows from an experience of a surprise that is beautiful. Because if you try to make it novel, you're aiming for a second thing, and that can be a problem. Another way to kind of think about it is if and this is a high root example, and it makes me think of Zizek as well, when he says, it's the power of the repetition, where there's always an excess in the repetition, which is a delusion point. If I say to you, there are rock climbers, but then there are rock climbers, you know there's a difference, right? I was able to create novelty in sameness. I was able to take the same thing and make it disclose itself to you in a new way, and actually create a deeper sense of meaning than if I were to say there are rock climbers and there are flower gardeners. Okay, well, that was novel. That was unexpected, but it was random, and it doesn't seem like it was really getting at anything. It felt like a list. Novelty can just create a list. It may not create a relationship. But when I say there are rock climbers and there are rock climbers, that's not a list. That's a sublation. That's a repetition that comes back in a new way. Like it comes back in an unexpected way. And there's a relation between rock climber and rock climber. There's a difference between a football player in high school and Brady. Oh, yeah, they're both football players, but they're not the same. And here's the key. The novelty and the repetition is located in the quality. The quality of the rock climber is what is emphasized. That is what is disclosing itself as primary, right? And what's novel is the art and expertise of the rock climber versus the rock climber. What's the difference? The art, the care, the passion, the beauty, the expertise is what comes forth. That emerges in the repetition. And what I mean by that, what do we learn so often in Eastern thought? They're like, you need to wash the same dish. You need to do the same repetition. You go on the same walk. You're not aiming for novelty. One day you wash the dish and bam, you see the dish for the first time. And it's like it's a brand new dish, but it's the same dish. That's what beauty does. Beauty has a long tradition, and so does eros versus mere lust. The problem is lust is a list. Lust just woman 1, woman 2, woman 3. Eros is when women becomes Michelle. Eros is when a category, a definition becomes a particular person. And eros is a moving into particularity. But the disclosure of particularity requires a repetition. The woman cannot become Michelle, my wife, without the repetition of the day in and the day out and the commitment. The new quality of experience that is Michelle required actually giving up novelty. I surrendered novelty and committed to this same woman or this same practice. You act the novelty of quality, giving the quantity. Because most people, when they go for novelty, they just say, they just make a list that's full of a bunch of different and random things. That's great, but you haven't created relations. You create relations by making novelty secondary and learning to participate in the thing in a manner that conditions yourself and the thing so that beauty discloses and the quality becomes novel. And the reason why you know it's the quality is because nothing has changed. You know that true novelty has appeared because it's the same house. It's the same woman. The sameness is the only way to encounter novelty. Because otherwise you can always just say it's the same different thing. It's the same thing in a different thing, right? It's just the same in different clothing. That's usually what happens. Most people confuse novelty with the same in different clothing. Like they say, well, I went to Florence, I went to Brazil, I went to Alabama. Yeah, but it's just the same travel destination. It's just a travel destination. It's not a revelation of a different way of living. If you want to have a different sense of subjectivity, like the possibility of community actually requires what? Sacrificing novelty. You have to commit to certain people. Otherwise, you don't have the repetition that can disclose itself as an excess, disclose itself as a beauty. And you see, really what ends up happening, and then I'll give it back to you, is we tend to actually, in the modern man, stuck in the tyranny of quantity, we end up just making lists. We just make resumes. We don't make any relations. We don't make any, to use the Leibniz term, we make lists, but not situations. We list out algebraic numbers, but we don't make geometrical situations. And I think basically you were asking this question of where is math located. You really cannot answer that unless you're trying to make lists. Because where is it? Okay, it's in the mind. You're just making a list of possibilities. If you want to find where math is, you have to exist in the relation of a situation. And this was Leibniz's point when he's arguing with Descartes. And so, and actually Leibniz was very concerned that the question of the reality of math would be separated from the apprehension of a situation that he follows in what's called the analysis of Citas, which is, I think, his greatest work. Anthony Morley is a world master on that. I suggest his book. And everyone talks about the monads separate from the analysis of Citas, which is a major mistake. And so what he's looking over, he's looking at Descartes and he says, hey, Descartes, imagine you're in this temple, okay? And you're in this temple and you're looking around. And imagine you were in he says, the only way you can talk about a temple as similar is a temple that if you were in, you would think it was the other temple. So let's say there's a temple in Virginia and there's a temple in Florida, just to make a crazy example. And when you were inside the temple, you thought you were in the other one. That means it's similar, that you can confuse them as the same, okay? The only way to know that it was not the same temple would be when you walk outside and go, oh, I'm in Florida. Well, that means you had to reference something what? Outside the temple. You had to reference a situation in order to actually give it the proper understanding, right? And so this is what Leibniz is getting at. If you ask the question, what it is possible within the temple to say this is the same temple as that, if you were teleported into the other, to create an equal sign. But he said, imagine that you brought the two temples into the same geometrical situation and saw them side by side. You would suddenly realize that what you thought was the same was actually similar. And guess what a similar thing is? Different. Similarity is not sameness because there is difference. But the only reason you're able to identify difference is because you're there comparing them. So he says all intelligibility is 3. You have to have 3ness in order to tell what a thing actually is. Otherwise, you could confuse it in error. So likewise, to define the number 1, you have to compare it with the number 2, which means that you are there comparing it. So the reality of numbers is found in the human situation. And the problem is, that means numbers are not, it's this weird thing where numbers, you ask, are numbers are created or discovered, right? What we discover is relation. And the numbers exist as real in the relation of the human with reality by which we're making judgments of similarity. Here's the key. All math is a judgment of similarity, of which we do because we think there's sameness, of which the sameness is not possible in nature. No two things in nature can be the same, because if they were the same, they would be the same, right? So nothing in nature is the same. But that means mathematics works because we're trying to make things the same in a nature where they could not be. When you locate math in algebra, you are trying to find its reality in sameness, where all the numbers line up, where the formulas all go together and are the same, because basically the equal sign means everything on this side is the same as what's on this side, right? You can never discover math in a realm of equal signs. You discover math in a realm of equivalent signs, similarity. Similarity is always experiential. Similarity is always relational because you're judging similarity. You're saying that's similar, therefore there's a difference, meaning the temple's here and this temple is there. right? Math is discovered within similarity, and it is created in equal signs. Math is created whenever it is reifying an equal sign, and it is discovered whenever it is reifying an equivalence or similarity, which means when it is a testament to a human relation to reality. And what Leibniz was warning is he said, Descartes, listen very closely. From geometry, you can get to algebra, and it's a very useful tool, but you must always come back to geometry. Because if you go down the road of thinking that algebra can exist without ultimately referencing geometry, basically, you know what he tells them? You're going to end up in endless conspiracy theories. Because mathematics is basically a conspiracy theory outside of situation. Everything lines up, all the things add, everything is there. The problem is it just doesn't correspond with reality. Mathematics in algebra without geometry has the epistemological structure of a conspiracy. And it can go on and on and on and on and on forever and ever and ever, because a conspiracy is an internally consistent system. Conspiracies are very rational. Like, they're not crazy. All the evidence is here. It all goes together. They're very logical. The problem is their coherence without correspondence. They completely cohere, like the Pritchett novel, The Crying of Lot 49. It's just that everything that you think is going on is not actually going on, but you're able to interpret the phenomenon you experience in a manner that suggests that it is going on. You could also think of an Umberto Eco in Foucault's Pendulum or something like that. It's a great book. Anyway, mathematics without geometry has the epistemological structure of a conspiracy. And you end up going on, and then you start confusing the conspiracy with reality, and then you get into all sorts of pathologies and trouble, right? And that's what Leibniz is warning Descartes. He's like, you must always bring algebra back to the realm of not the equal sign, but of the equivalent sign. Like the sign of similarity, not of equalness. Because if you try to do a mathematics of sameness, of saying 2 plus 2 equals 4, because Leibniz is basically saying 2 plus 2 is equivalent to 4. It's not equal to 4, because the number 2 and the number 2, even it can never come together to become 4. They can only be like 4. So he's really defending analogy. He's really defending also kind of Aquinas and, all of these kind of analogy of being, the debates with Duns Scotus and all this. And Leibniz is like, mathematics must be analogous. It must be equivalent, or else it's going to waste a whole lot of time. And hasn't it? Hasn't it with physics and all of the other theories? Like, all the time that has basically been wasted in theorizing, actually hypothesizing, because it's not even theory. Leibniz is like, you're going to just come up with like a world of hypothesis that can never be experimented on, that because of its coherence is going to seem plausible. And if you don't realize that plausibility is not enough to equal truth, you're going to just be lost down that rabbit hole forever. And actually, he's like, and the problem is, in a way, it's beautiful. It's beautiful to see all of these things add up, but it's the beauty that is cheap. It's a cheap beauty that is not worked through situation, because real beauty has the possibility of bleeding and demanding something of you. Like, real beauty can demand something of you. You must change your life, like the Rilke poem. Leibniz is saying, Descartes, you're creating a beauty that doesn't demand anything of you. In fact, it may just send you off on a conspiracy. And critically, beauty, in order to be a good for Plato and all the classical thinkers, has to be in a relationship with the true, the beautiful, and the good. You have to have all three. If you separate the true from the beautiful, it becomes like facticity and cruel. If you have good without true, then it's probably just good intention and manipulation. But if you have beauty without the good and the true, you can get seduction and manipulation that way, right? So you have to have all three. The possibility of separating the beauty, the true, and the good is much higher in the realm of algebra than in the realm of geometry. If you literally can only operate according to intelligibility in relation, then the possibility of a false beauty is much lower. The possibility of a false good is a lot lower. So for that example, it's really easy to come up with good ideas when you're not in the presence of the other. When you're just writing and coming up what you think is good, and you're not with someone who's the other who has, it's freaking easy. We can all come up with our moral thought experiments when the other's not around. But when we're in relation, that's a different thing. So it goes, we can come up with what we think is beautiful, but you see, outside of relation, beauty just tends to be taste. It tends to be what we like and enjoy. Like everyone's like, beauty
Yeah.
is just a matter of preference. Yeah, beauty is a matter of preference outside of relation. That's what frickin' Leibniz is warning you. Goodness is everyone's like, nah, morality is oppressive. Foucault posts about like the good is just used to oppress people. Yeah, outside of relation, it is. When you just have a central planner coming up with the goods, that's what happens. True. Oh, there's no such thing as truth. Truth is just power. Yeah, outside of relation, it is. Because the intelligibility of the true, the beautiful, and the good is not in the triplex of everyone in relation. It's based on ideas that cannot be challenged by the empathy, the face, and the Leibniz sense of the other, right? So Leibniz is basically suggesting if you don't think mathematics, always returning to an equivalence of geometry and similarity, you're going to end up with a whole lot of trouble. That's modernity. We ended up with a whole lot of trouble.
Yeah. I mean, it's screaming left hemisphere Ian McGilchrist's.
Yeah, it is.
Right?
Yes.
Like, big time, and right brain then being or geometry, or even just mind and heart, like all these dualisms in a sense. And I feel like the what was coming to me is that the true, the good, and the beautiful in relation bind each other, right? There's like a binding function.
Yes,
They keep each other accountable in some sense. And so that's really, really, really nice to see it and hold it that way. Because like the way I was expressing it before, yeah, it did make me sound like a beauty fundamentalist, neglecting the other two, but they need each other. They need each other. And I think the emphasis on beauty right now is because like we have like overemphasized truth. And we're somewhere with good, but they're a bit confused, especially postmodernism, and then beauty is just like totally neglected.
Gone. It's complete. The emphasis is completely necessary today. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's that emphasis towards beauty, and so yeah. Wow. I mean, I was also hearing a lot of like the Tao that is nameable is not the eternal Tao, this type of language, right? Like as soon as we name the thing, it's not the thing. And that's basically what Leibniz and Descartes are sort of arguing about. Leibniz sounds like a super cool, wise guy. I want to discover more about Leibniz because it's like this. I really, really, really like the algebra geometry distinction. I think it's so, so cool. It's a really cool distinction. And I get excited because then I think about the thing we're working on, the object-oriented web, and how you can start to do relations in that super fucking high dimensional space, and what that looks like, and of course the company is called Metatron, which is and so there's the Metatron cube, right, which is like the source of sacred geometry in some sense, and it's like, oh my god, so it all comes back to geometry. So this geometric perspective on life and seeing it in terms of relationship and like creating more and more, I guess there's tons of language, synergistic relationship and things that are just this positive spiral. I is the thing that I see. That
not to interrupt. I mean, I will just say that basically, if we think about all technology should be in service of creating geometry, not algebra. Now you have a kind of metric by which to think about design. Right now, the problem is without that kind of heuristic, your output can be algebraic because that's what you've been taught is good. That you've been taught what you should do. And definitely Leibniz, just as a quick note, I definitely think Leibniz has been overlooked. I mean, another thing people know about the monads, I can't defend this perfectly right now, but I think of a way to think about the monad is the smallest of all possible situations, where an atom is the smallest of all possible things. So one of the reasons we're confused is because we say everything is made up of atoms, the small, like building blocks, right? Leibniz would be say like at the smallest level of reality, you will find a relation, you will find a situation is the term. Yeah, like he talks about situations more than like meta situations more than relations, but it's a relation. So like what he's saying is that, and this is kind of it, honestly, you see it in someone like a Wolfgang Smith with vertical causation and different things like that, is he's like the smallest building blocks of reality are situations. They're monads. They're not atoms. Atoms, the smallest unit in reality is not a thing. It is a situation. And, he's also kind of suggesting as a Christian that, well, yeah, because God's a Trinity, so reality is like the Trinity. It's many in one. God is a situation if he's a Trinity, right? So you would expect that the universe made in the image and likeness of God would also be a situation all the way down on every level. So he's indirectly suggesting that because he's ultimately saying too that the Trinity is not a contradiction in Christianity. You can have three as one because there's only situation, there's only geometry. The Trinity is only a contradiction in an algebraic reality. And he's like, well, reality isn't algebraic, so it's not a contradiction. And he's like, and actually, if you pay attention, we're always in a Trinitarian intelligibility. We are always in an intelligibility of a situation. We're never algebraic. We're always in relation, automatic. The moment you look at that bookcase, bam, there's a relation, right? And basically all he's saying is we need to own what is. And beauty plays a role, and let me give it back to you because I interrupted you, is that beauty is a reminder of situation. Beauty only makes sense as the situation. And in the sense also, too, for everyone to be an artist, art is situational. Art is not replaceable by an algebraic variable. There is the doing of it. And so to say, like, everything depends on art, it depends on art in the sense of, one, people have to feel for your product or feel for what you're doing. They don't feel anything, won't be motivated to do it. But it also has to be art sense that it is a revelation to people of the subjectivity that they can have and that is possible, that is toward the geometrical and thus toward the possibility of receiving life in a manner that makes you self-forgetful and overflowing. Like overflowing is by definition situational because you can't overflow if you're just a cup. You have to have like wine in the cup and there has to be a world outside the cup for the overflowing to occur. Like overflowing as the wine in the Heideggerian sense we were saying earlier is all a testament to a kind of life that is not trying to get a thing, but to participate in a situation as overflowing, and thus a testament to the beauty that is possible, that then inspires other people to do that themselves, and now we have a network effect of beauty, right? Like kids see movies and they're like, I want to be a movie maker. They listen to music and I want to be a musician. We were saying like if they had the freedom of speech, I want to have that kind of subjectivity. Well, if you witness people overflowing, I want to be that kind of subject. I want to kind of do that, right? Well, then you have that spreading of the network effect, right? And so art in being the center of spreading an art, like an art of living, an art of dwelling, as Ivan Illich would say, then has that ability. And who knows? We always talk about the network effects of intelligence. Like, wow, once you put intelligence together, who knows what might emerge, right? Man, what would the network effects of beauty be? What would the network effects of art be? Who knows what kind of beauty might emerge if we had a world that was engaged in network effects of beauty? And I think anything that's kind of part of that or contributing to that vision is very, very important.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a very I think one of the things I'm appreciating a lot just in conversation with you is you're articulating things that I haven't found language for. And I guess that's also the beauty of philosophy in a lot of ways, right? It's just exactly that. Because I mean, I love it, right? This is exactly it. And it's a very, I mean, it's like we're finding language for these like highly subjective, qualitative things in a way. So like when I think of this network effect of beauty, it's like that is super fucking highly qualitative, right? That is like, it's like I've started talking with some people from this I guess from the Mark Gaffney space, like it's the field of eros, and like literally you can create this field with other people that are like in that field of eros, and it's a different experience of reality that you create together, right? And it's so fucking obvious, right? And then once you have a shift of experience like that doesn't involve any meditation, any psychedelics, any substance whatsoever, right? It's just purely because of the relationship with another or a group of others that you really notice the shift in the quality of experience, that you first of all even become more sensitive to different qualities of the experience, which is I think a lot of what we're talking about as this artistic experience or artist phenomenology of life, right? And so that I think, I mean, that's really interesting. And then also the self-forgetfulness and overflowing, I'm sort of holding that in a quite similar way because it seems like a similar energy in some sense.
Yeah. Yep.
And it's like, and that is always situational. So I like, was it Leibniz, I guess you said? Yeah, the monads like that are like, okay,
Yep.
on the deepest level, it's not an atom, it's a relation, it's a situation, or
Yep. Yep.
Whiteheadian in a way, right? Like it's all relation. And I'm there, right? It's like it's the wave and the particle. It's like literally, and then it go even on an esoteric level. It's like you can go all the way, and it says it in the fucking text, depending on where you look, that this is it, and you can experience it. There's experiences of this, right?
Yep.
And it's like, so my ontology is right there with you and with those people you mentioned, and and so then the edge of what I'm trying to express here is like, if it really is all situational in this very, or relational, it doesn't matter what language we use, then I think back to what you said about the striking of beauty, right?
Mm.
How that is yeah, that is always like, obviously that is like by definition situational and relational. But it's like I think what I'm trying to express is um like I don't know how to express this, but like you can live life in a way where beauty discloses itself like all the fucking time. you know? And it's like, it can be quite overwhelming. And for me, and I think and it takes practice, right? And a commitment to live a life that way. Like I think I I'm thinking, for example, every morning I do my morning meditation, and I sit down, and I always end the meditation with just like this fucking overwhelming sense of gratitude of like, oh my God, I get to be alive. What a gift. I get to see stuff. I get to hear stuff. I get to experience all this stuff. I'm only 27. I still have a whole fucking life to live. Like, and this like overwhelming sense of gratitude just to like be alive and experience another day. And then also contemplate death and be like, okay, it's a finite life. So let's enjoy every bit of today. I think that is like a very tangible way to sort of practice disclosing more beauty, because it's hard not to disclose more beauty if like you really taste the preciousness of life, right? So there's something about that I think is gets to a very like moving from where we were now as on an abstract philosophical level to something like tangible. Okay, look, this is a practice, for example, and it's hard to like people make gratitude lists. And it's I'm not talking gratitude list. That's like the opposite. It's not a list. It's a fucking like felt sense of like overwhelming gratitude to be alive, and that seems like the opposite of a list. So yeah.
Well, there's a few things that come to mind, and alas, I will have to go in a little bit here for work and different things, but I've really enjoyed
Oh,
it,
oh, me too.
and
That's it. Yeah.
so I won't make you late. And I think the very fact everything can be beautiful. That means there's a risk of arbitrariness for beauty, but the very risk of arbitrariness is necessary for the possibility of the all-encompassness of beauty. So the question is the following: how do we have beauty be an all-encompassing experience, a regular experience, without making it arbitrary? Thanksgiving seems to be a lot of it. I think it's Galatians that says something like, all things are good when realized in a spirit of thanksgivingness. And Thanksgiving, what ultimately also arises is, a lot of people say beauty is relative. I think the key is that beauty is conditional. And what I mean by that is, in order to read Tolstoy, you have to meet the condition of being literate, right? Like, it's not a relative matter. Like Tolstoy, you have to meet a condition, right? Well, likewise, I can tell you there were many novels, like The Sound and the Fury by Faulkner, which when I first read it, I hated it. I met the condition of being literate, but I didn't meet the condition of understanding it. And then after going through some lectures and reading, suddenly I got to the place where I was conditioned. I met the condition of understanding The Sound and the Fury. And thus it became one of the greatest novels I'd ever read, right? And then it was also beautiful because I could see Caddy and Benjamin and Quentin and all relating and so on and so forth. Everything is beautiful, but you have to meet the conditions to experience them as beautiful, which is on you. And then the question is, what are the conditions to experience, say, suffering as beautiful, or the conditions needed to experience a tree as beautiful, or to experience a novel as beautiful?
Can I say one thing?
Please.
So the mathematics piece gets really interesting again, right? Because it's like I can train in mathematics and appreciate deeper and deeper levels and layers of mathematics. So yeah.
Absolutely. And likewise, train in, relation. You can train in relations and appreciate deeper and deeper relations. In Dante, there's this strange notion that falling in love with some random girl in Florence is the first rung on a ladder all the way to God. That's weird. Well, it turns out that initial erotic experience is trained to the eros of the beatific vision, but there's condition by condition by condition along the way. The conditions to just fall in love with a random girl at 18 is being born. The condition of experiencing her as Beatrice, that requires a conditioning of sanctification and sacrifice and process and work, but then you can. And then experiencing Beatrice on the way to the beatific vision, that requires the condition of not turning one's head on the 30th canto or something like that. So beauty is conditional, not relative. It seems relative because it is conditional, because everyone is at different conditions and they've met different conditions for different particular objects, because there are as many possible conditions as there are possible relations, but those conditions are not merely relative to taste. They are what are disclosed by the conditioning of a life. They are linked to life choices. And everyone can become a unique partial object because of beauty. And here's the key. This means that you can have difference and yet unity, because everyone can be unified by an experience of beauty, but then pluralistic in particular in the particularity that they are as a representation to the world of the conditioning they've undergone.
Of that experience.
Yes, that's correct. But so everyone has a beauty that is part of the beauty. And that's the only way to deal with the problem of pluralism. And, because the problem of pluralism at the end of the day is everyone is different. How do we have anything in common? We were saying at the beginning, money dealt with this. The commodity form has dealt with this. The technology has dealt with how do we make difference have something in common. If you want to have a non-reductionistic possibility of pluralism, it will have a lot to do with beauty. Because experiences of beauty and overflowing is something we can all share, but the way you overflow is very different from how I overflow, but we share in overflowing and in the experience of beauty. So we have because now we have a what? Similarity without sameness. We're geometrical. We can relate without reducing. Because reductionism is the product of sameness. When I say we're the same, I've reduced us. If I want to have non-reductionism without having non-relation, because all non-reductionism runs the risk of non-relation because I cannot make you intelligible, then we need a way to be similar. Well, that would be that we're similar. Right? The Heideggerian term. If we're similar and I don't care, well, who cares? For us to care about our similarity, that's why beauty is critical. Because when I experience your beauty, I care by definition, because it strikes me. So I see similarity that I care about. It won't do to simply say we're similar because we're all Republican or Democrat or whatever. It has to be a similarity we care about. And that's what beauty provides without removing pluralism. And so beauty as a basis of socio-political interaction allows us to deal with the problem of the many and the one, the problem of pluralism. And then the question is, how do you create institutions that increases the probability that the average person can condition themselves for the experience of beauty and to be conditioned by the other for those experiences? And I think it has a lot to do with the freeing of speech because speech trains us in the ability of the phenomenology of the artist, openness, but also saying, interacting. You'll see speaking and the way artists speak and creatives change, the way of seeing that kind of apophatic emerge in the circling or the dialogos. You have the commutative rationality of Habermas, you have the great enrichment of McCloskey, and all of these different things. Speaking becomes the educational medium that best incubates the conditionality of beautiful versus the trivia test, because the trivia test is algebraic. And here's the other, I forgot to say this, is very important. You know how we're saying like all of this has to do with quality over quantity, and then I know I'll bring it to click as well. Leibniz makes a really big point to Descartes. He says, Leibniz, I got 2 apples over there. Count them. And you go 1, 2. And it's like, why did you count those apples? You know why you counted them? Because they share a quality. All quantification comes after a qualification. The only reason you count things together is because they share a quality. You don't go apple, bookshelf. That doesn't make any sense. All counting requires quality to come first. There's no such thing as quantification without quality. The whole reason you're quantifying things together is because you believe they share a quality. So actually, the difference between counting and listing, which is the difference between relation and chaos, is quality. You count qualities. Why do you count those numbers together? Because they share the quality of being numbers. Why do you count those apples together? Because they share similar qualities. And counting is the basis of all intelligibility because it's a judgment of similarity. You're constantly, when you're making things intelligible, judging relation. All quality is always relational because it is always a quality relative to a situation. That's why it stands out. It has that standing outness. Value is always relational. It is always in a situation that makes the value disclose itself. That's what Heidegger is saying with the wine, right? So quality is necessary for quantity. So this world in which quantity exists without quality is self-effacing. By definition, it is a logical contradiction that eats itself. So in a funny way, to return to quality is actually to return to the only thing that has ever existed. And we're just lucky that in this world of non-existence, we haven't blown ourselves up yet. And now we're kind of given a grace, if you will, an opportunity to go, you know what? Quantity is not possible with quality. And this is also, here's the key, the greatest quantity. What is the greatest quantity that you can experience that is the greatest testament of value and eros and beauty? The greatest quantity of all is 1 of 1. The 1 of 1 is the greatest quantity, which means a testament to the supreme quantity, the supreme quantification that human beings as valuing and erotic and situational and meaningful beings are searching for is a 1 of 1, which is a quantification that necessarily is disclosing equality. Quantification is always seeking to be qualification. That's what quantification wants. The movement of eros, in a sense, is a algebra searching for geometry, points looking for relations, movements and dwelling and wooing into a 1 of oneness. And that 1 of oneness creates what? Desire, want. The 1 of oneness motivates. What's the problem in economics? People don't have motivation. What's the point? Mental illness, right? That's what happened. The loss of desire, which leads to the stagnation of an economics, all is going to emerge from a world that cannot cultivate experiences of 1 of oneness and that cannot train people to condition themselves to experience the 1 of oneness, which is the supreme achievement of quantification and its negation of itself to a testament to the primacy of qualification, which is the supreme achievement of eros. The supreme achievement of eros is when the woman Dante sees becomes Beatrice. When the woman as a category and a definition becomes a definitive object and also a partial object in the sense that if you want to know the fullness of Beatrice, you have to commit to a lifelong relation. And then the novelty emerges continually in the sameness as a testament to beauty. And that's what it would mean to put art as central. That's what it would mean to reclaim beauty. And that's what I think we need to do today.
Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Wow.
Hallelujah.
Amazing. Amazing, amazing. 1 of oneness. I really like that. Yeah. I had this felt sense and image of like swimming in the qualitative, right? It's like all around.
Yep.
It's all qualitative. And if we can convey that point that the quantitative relies on the qualitative, like it is all qualitative, and then we make it quantitative.
Yep.
That's a huge move if we can convey that to people. So,
Yeah.
and I know
All intelligence, it's all count. And another way to put it is that math that is counting is discovered. Math that is listing is created. Math that is geometrical is discovered. Math that is algebraic is created. The problem is not all math is the same. We tend to treat it as a monocategory, where we say, does math exist or is it created? When it's actually different maths exist and are discovered while others are created. Just like worldviews. Some are conspiracies, some are true. It just depends. And the key differentiation between math that is discovered versus math that is created is quality. Well, of course, quality can only exist. Quality can only exist. And so math that is based on quality has to exist. It exists in the relation of the human with the phenomenon that are being qualified. Funny thing.
So, yeah, but then it's like, but there's something about then there's the difference between equivalency and equal, right? Like,
absolutely.
And that introduces some sort of like relativeness in the relationship compared to some absoluteness in the relationship. And I don't know if there is, I guess, I mean, is there absolute relation? Right? Is there, it's
an excellent question. There is absolute conditioning. Like, you cannot not condition and you cannot not be in relation, but there's absolute particularity. Everything has to be particular. It cannot not be particular. But the funny thing about that is that means this also helps us deal with the problem of hierarchy, though, in the sense that the higher up the ontological hierarchy you climb, the more particular the phenomenon becomes, and thus all of your knowledge about it cannot be spread to other things. So when you base ontological hierarchy on particularity, you also deal with the problem of truth as power that Foucault and all of them are warning about. They're like, well, ontology and metaphysics is just used to control people. Well, if it's a metaphysics of apprehension, the more you know the thing and you become better at conditioning yourself to being, say, a really great artistic winemaker, you're not a really great car maker, right? So this is where you can have hierarchy without having dominance, because it is based on the intimacy of the relation and participation with the particularity. And that process is absolute, but the unfolding of that absolute is conditional. And that's, like you were saying, eternal values evolve, right? The absolute evolves in this sense. This is Hegel with the absolute idealism. The world is absolute as a process. The process is absolute. There is no non-process. So that's absolute, but the absolute is open. It's an open absolute. It's incomplete with the in parentheses, you can say. And basically what it means is, Alexander Bard, and I do think this is very useful, talks about the virtual, the potential, and the actual. The virtual, which is basically imaginary thought, these things don't exist, and yet they have causal impacts on reality to the degree we will them. Because, like, the thought of the number 2 is weak. It can't do anything to me like the sun can, or even the potential of a bridge falling. Like, the potential of a bridge falling is not contingent on my thought. A bridge could fall just because it's weak, right? That potential is part of the actuality of the bridge, right? But the idea of the bridge being used for a kids' carnival, that's weak in the sense of I have to make it happen, right? So the issue is that the virtuality is where mathematics, the ideas to condition ourselves to beautiful, all of these things are located. But here's the problem. They're weak in the sense of we have to choose them, which means if we don't, then we don't create a world that's having the network effect of beauty or that's moving toward the particular. Like, reality, what Hegel is suggesting is that there is a certain determinism of process, but not a determinism of outcome. Like, the absolute is process. You cannot overcome the process, and there are deterministic elements in the process, such as a bridge will one day fall. That's deterministic. But it's, again, the problem is thinking it's either all determinism or it's all not. Hegel would be like, objects entail potential, but no virtuality. Like, the object of a bridge does not have the idea of being used for a kids' carnival. And one day the bridge will fall. That is determined. But the idea that the bridge is used for a kids' carnival, since that's located in the virtual, is not determined. So humans are able to engage in determination, determining of what is determined, and that is what the virtual is. But because the virtual is weak, in the sense of it requires agency to bring about. Things like a world that negates sublates to beauty must be actively willed. It will not simply emerge through time, like the falling of a bridge will, because beauty requires a conditioning that is only virtually realized. To make a distinction between virtual and potential. The conditions of beauty are not in potential. The conditions of beauty are in the virtual. And that means we as humans have to do something, but that means we have an invitation to be creators. Means we have an invitation to be artists. That means all of us are always already in the position of the artist, but don't realize it.
Yeah.
We
Wow.
are in.
Going full
So
circle here.
really, yeah. So what we have to do is make people realize what they always already are, to return to the place of our beginnings and know it for the first time, as T.S. Eliot said. So the place where the fire and the rose are one and neither is consumed, so that we can handle more humanity. Because for most of history, as the little bird says at the beginning of that poem, humanity has never been able to handle very much reality. Well, that's makes sense, because we've been trying to handle a reality that's algebraic and doesn't exist. You can't handle that. But a reality that's geometrical, situational, and created according to the virtual, we've never had the chance. So we have the chance now, if only we receive the invitation. And I believe people are doing the work to make possible that invitation. And so the work continues.
So the work continues. Hallelujah. All right. I really gotta go. But thank you.
I appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Really love
Thank
this.
you, Nikki.
I love it. I love it.
Have a good.
Continue this. And yeah,
Yes,
let's
sir.
keep the conversation alive. It's amazing. It's really, really good. I love it.
I've enjoyed it, sir. Thank you so much. Best with everything, my friend. All the best.
Bye.